Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Today, we want to talk about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, in the wake of the recent holiday celebration, which I still remember when it was made a legal holiday back in like 85, 86, and how happy I was at that time. But then what was interesting was that when I matriculated into Akron, Dr. Holmes, and took a couple classes with you, you kind of taught me how the media had kind of taken King's legacy and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I took it was they kind of used it for their own purposes.
Right.
You know, so Dre, let's start with you, because I know when you were at Cheney working as a journalist, you had an opportunity to interview Dr. King's sister-in-law. Can we talk a little bit about that?
That was shortly after the passing of Coretta Scott King. And it was interesting because, I mean, when we look at Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, you just see this couple that looks like they were meant to be, like they were just one big old happy family. And I was shocked to find out that Martin Luther King Jr. was the first Black man Coretta Scott King had ever dated. You know, so it was like she went from dating white men exclusively to dating the Black man of the time, you know. And her sister was talking about how she had introduced the two. And this was going back to Boston. And it was intriguing because it's so often, you know, we hear, I have a dream, you know, Martin Luther King with turn the other cheek, you know, nonviolence, but nobody dives into the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And I mean, that's the part that bothers me the most, you know, as a former journalist, as, you know, a Black man, as a person who had to go through grade school learning, oh, Martin Luther King believed that everybody should be equal. And you hear these things, but you never hear about Martin Luther King's personal life, the life that none of us really know, or none of us really want to examine. But she talked exclusively about, you know, him smoking, you know, him having an ashtray close by because he was a smoker. You know, and we sitting in a house where Martin Luther King Jr. had visited and stayed, you know, right outside of Cheney University, right down the road, actually. And you're sitting there and you're looking, it's like, my goodness, you know, he was a small man. The bed that he slept in was a small bed. And, you know, you look at that and you think about how small he was, and looking at it was like a twin size bed or a full size bed. And it's like, man, he and Coretta Scott King fit in that one bed. So now you see them as these bigger than life people that are average size. You know, so it's like and when you think about it, videos that you've seen of Martin Luther King Jr. during marches or whatever the case may be, he's always projected as big. And then you realize by looking at other pictures, like family pictures, and there's some fraternity pictures, some alpha pictures of him. It's like, man, he was tiny, you know. So it to me it whittles the man down. It's like, okay, so he's bigger than life, made by the media. He's the safe spot, you know. You even Aaron Rodgers was quoting, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. this year when it came to his vaccination, and it bothers me because Martin has become the safe Black man.
Right.
You know, he is not the lightning rod that George Floyd is, a Trayvon Martin. I mean, different times, you know, different eras, I get it. But at the same time, the media has put Martin Luther King Jr. so far ahead of everybody else. I mean, I think he might even be safer than Barack Obama.
Right.
You know, when you sit back and you look at things, and it's interesting to me because there was a point in time where he wasn't the safe Black man, you know. And like you said, you know, I remember when it became a legal holiday. I also remember Arizona being the last state to recognize it.
Right.
And the fallout from that, because Public Enemy came out with a song, By the Time I Get to Arizona. You know, so it's interesting to see how the once polarizing Martin Luther King Jr. Has become the safest Black man in the face of today with George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and such.
And you know what's so interesting about that, and I agree with everything you said. And it's funny how the media will take that image that they created and try to use it against more militant African warriors, I should say. I remember back in the day when Phil Donahue was still on the air, kind of dating myself a little bit. And there was H. Rap Brown, I think Bobby Seale, a couple of people, you know, that would be considered more militant were on there. And some, you know, ladies stood up and said, you guys are just going against everything Martin Luther King did and said. And, you know, H. Rap Brown was like, oh, so you speak for Martin Luther King now, you know. But not only that, but it's like, you want to tell this Black man, you want to use Martin Luther King against him. But when I was in elementary school, I was always taught about the militant actions of the founding fathers. You know, they took the tea and threw it in the harbor, and that was heralded. You know, anything that they did, they picked up muskets and formed militias, and that was heralded as being courageous. But then when Africans, you know, look to be more militant, rather, you know, they want to use Martin Luther King's image that they created against those African warriors, even before Martin Luther King. And this is kind of off the subject, but it was interesting that America had just gained fought for their independence from Great Britain in 1789. And then when Haiti fought for their independence against France in 1804, Thomas Jefferson, one of the architects of the American Revolution, said the Haitians were savages, you know, for fighting for their independence, which, you know, weren't we just doing that, or not we, but weren't you all just doing that 5 years ago? And now these people are savages. So the interesting thing, and I'm glad we got, you know, it's great we got Dr. Neil Holmes with us, as we always do anyway. But Dr. Holmes, you were the first one that taught me about the other side of Martin Luther King, you know, because when I was in elementary school, all I heard was, I have a dream speech and nonviolence and walking and marching and singing, we shall overcome, getting hit in the head with bricks, but not retaliating. Then you taught me about the Poor People's March and his stance against Vietnam. And then you said, like, well, once he, you know, went against the federal government, he knew that his days were numbered. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to mention a good video that because Dre was talking about the man king, and there's a good video, shows him smoking and all that kind of stuff. It's it's called Citizen King. Citizen King. It's a very good video. Shows the different periods of his movement that he was a part of and that he helped to lead, but also that he was part of a larger movement. I think there are a lot of aspects of King, and I want to start off because when I was coming up, you know, I remember the day when King was assassinated, and just prior to his assassination, the FBI listed him as the most dangerous Negro in America. Now, for the FBI to call you the most dangerous Negro in America means that you have the capacity to move people. And King had a great capacity to move people. Now, as I was coming up and so forth, you had the Black Power movement, and some people attempted to pose the Black Power movement against King. There were, you know, some differences here and there, but Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael as he was known then, taught us that you know, he had a very good relationship with King,
right,
and a very close relationship, and they learned from each other. You know, they were colleagues, and he taught us that, you know, the important thing that King did was taught us how to confront. That we confronted the situation, and when you look at that "I Have a Dream" speech. That speech was 1963. He had 5 more years to his work the work that he did. And he really started his work in many ways in 1955. So from 1955 to 1963, that's 8 years. And then from 1963 to 1965, that's another 5 years. So that's about 13 years that's unaccounted for. And we take that one sound bite,
right,
and make and kind of cram him into that sound bite. So we have to understand that in 1959, for instance, King wrote a preface to a book called Negroes with Guns. It was a book that was written by Robert Williams, who was an NAACP man down in North Carolina, also a Marine veteran, who armed the citizens, Black citizens of his town, and did that to confront the Klan. In that preface to the book, King explained his nonviolent strategy thusly. He said, no one condemns the right for self-defense, armed self-defense. And in 1957, he said many people would probably look at Black folks and Negroes, as he said then, as being courageous to defend themselves. But he said, my point is I want to do more than defend myself. I want to go from the defense, I want to go over to the offense. And he said, in order to have a strong offense, we want to have a disciplined, nonviolent movement. He was, building off of things that Gandhi had done, and he was also influenced by Kwame Nkrumah. And I was reading this piece here, and he influenced Kwame Nkrumah. But in 1957, 1957, he traveled to Ghana for the independence celebration. And when he came back, April 7th, if you go on YouTube or you go on Google, this April 7th, 1957 sermon that he did, a birth of a new nation is what you'll see it called. And he's talking about this new nation in Ghana. And at one point he says, and he compares the birth of this new nation, Ghana, to the dying of the British Empire. He says, at one point, the British used to brag about the sun never setting on its empire, but he said now you can hardly ever see the sun on the British Empire. So he's saying something is dying that's old. He's talking about imperialism, and something new that was being born, African independence and so forth, a new type of nation. And he, in that sermon, encouraged Black folks to go to Ghana to help build that country. And one quick passage I want to read here. He said he started crying near the end of the speech. And he said, I was crying for joy. I knew all about all of the struggles and all of the pain and all of the agony that these people had gone through for this moment. After Nkrumah had made that final speech, it was about 12:30. This is the midnight speech. And we walked away, and we could hear little children, 6 years old, and old people, 80 and 90 years old, walking the streets of Accra crying, freedom, freedom, freedom. They couldn't say it in the sense that we had said. Many of them didn't speak English the way we did, but they had their accents and it could ring out freedom. They were crying it in a sense that they had never heard it before. And I could hear that old Negro spiritual once more crying out, free at last, free at last. Great God Almighty, I'm free at last. So the free at last that we hear in 1963, he spoke that same free at last in Ghana at the independence of the first independent nation in Africa, at least what we call sub-Saharan Africa. And it was the leading and most radical country emerging at that particular time. So King was there. King was also on the battlefield. He was a man of ideas. He was a man of thought. He wrote, I think, maybe 8, 9 books, several books. And he was an organizer. The SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was developed by King. And we have to understand the context within which it was developed. In 64, I believe, the state of Alabama made the NAACP illegal. It was illegal to join. I think it was illegal in Alabama to join the NAACP. In some states, it was illegal for teachers to belong to the NAACP. So at the very point, at the very time that the state makes the civil rights organization illegal, King steps forward and say, look, we're gonna stand up and organize our people openly, and you can join this umbrella. So we're gonna take over where the NAACP left off. King didn't emerge by himself, as his sister-in-law would say, because you had a very in that Birmingham town, I mean not Birmingham, but Montgomery, you had a very active community prior to King. And so you had people like Joanne Robinson, who was a faculty member, taught a professor at HBCU, Alabama State, who had organized a group called Women's Political Council. They were the ones that had put up 3 women, 2 prior to Rosa Parks, 3 women to try to boycott the buses. Every night, Joanne Robinson went to bed, she had a 38 under a pillow. You had E.D. Nixon, who was an organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union organizer. And he was the one who actually tapped King for a leadership role and taught King how to use some labor tactics and confrontational tactics, and not just to figure out that we'll go behind closed doors and negotiate with the party power structure, but actually use kind of bare knuckles of power tactics. So you had a boycott, a bus boycott, that forced the, at that time the buses were private, forced the bus company to its knees. So you had a community that was extremely well organized. We don't have these types of communities today, Black communities today. We need to rebuild those. It's one of the things that the people who want to control us have done is destroy our communities through gentrification and other means. So and lastly, King, not only was he an organizer and he was a man of faith. And as a man of faith, you can also talk about a Kingian or theology from King. Now, this theology says that his notion of love was not a soft thing. His thing was, look, that person that you're confronting, you have to transform them into a better person. And you have to, if you really believe in this Jesus path, then you have to put your life on the line and you have to change society. So he was key in developing the Progressive Baptist Association, which was a Baptist association which was more progressive and more radical than your, some of your other Baptist associations. And finally, he took that move against U.S. militarism around the world, because he understood that as long as you were pouring billions and trillions of dollars into this war machine, that poor people were going to suffer, because we were the ones, poor folks, red, yellow, black, and white, and whatever other colors existed, were all the people who were getting, who were suffering, because that money was money that could be used for healthcare, education, etc., was killing brown people. And not only that, but he said we need to be on the same side of the revolution that the Vietnamese. He said we need to be on the side of the Vietnamese in their revolution. He said they're doing the right thing. We need to, not only do we need to not invade there, but we need to be doing what they're doing in terms of trying to create more justice and so forth for people. So and lastly, well, 2 more things. He was involved in the labor movement. and that's where he was killed in leading a strike in Memphis.
Right.
And out of that strike, you have a new union. I mean, not a new, well, a new union at that time emerged, the AFSCME movement, which allowed public workers, one of the first public workers unions to emerge. And in his last march, I mean, in that last march, and in some of his marches, he was protected often by the Deacons for Defense. And these were armed men, armed Africans in the South, and armed community people that protected them. And so when he no longer uses state troopers, but now we're using a black protection to protect the marches, these were all signals that King had to go.
Right.
And you got to understand something. A price was put on his head by businessmen. So we see businessmen right now in a way that they've never done before. And I'm talking big business now, entering governmental offices all across the country, from the presidency up to state governors, etc. And that's because, you know, they have to control it now because they were losing a grip on this thing. But you had businessmen in St. Louis, which was one of the has a history itself that needs to be discussed sometime. And then you had this killing of King after he had been termed the most dangerous Negro in America by the FBI. So he was a person who had international ties. He fought for Africa, not only supported Nkrumah, but he was protesting for Nelson Mandela's release back in 1964.
Right.
He was a man of faith, but he was a man of faith that faith had to be put into action. He was a man of thought, and he was a man of ideas that was expressed in written form. And lastly, he was a person when he spoke, not only we get sometimes carried away by the eloquence of his speaking, but the content of his speaking is very important. So at once he could speak and people from all walks of life could understand him in different, so he could speak to a vast audience. When he was introduced at the 1963 rally by A. Philip Randolph, who's the guy who had organized the original March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph introduced him as the moral leader of the country. So he was the person that set the moral tone for the country. And as long as he set a moral tone that fought for justice, those slimy folks who were bloodsuckers were in trouble.
Now, let me ask you this. You gave us a lot to think about, you know, that the average person doesn't know about, you know, Dr. King. Dre probably knows a lot of this being a journalist, the research that he did, but I'm just talking about like the average person, you know, like we said in the outset, most of them only know I have a dream. But there's one thing I want to touch on that you mentioned, his outspokenness against Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think specifically, and Dre, I don't know if you have an opinion on this too, why do you think specifically that has been swept under the rug? And here's why I say that. Even today, you know, when I'm on social media, sometime on Facebook, I'm only on it really because of this program, honestly. Somebody might mention Ali, you know, Muhammad Ali, and people, oh, he was the greatest, blah, blah, blah. But there's always that one person, I don't like Ali, he was a draft dodger. Well, for one, he didn't dodge the draft, he objected to the draft, but that's a whole nother discussion. So there's still people that, even though the consensus now amongst most people, other than the most conservative Americans, is that Vietnam was a mistake, you know, there's still some people who won't let Muhammad Ali off the hook for being a draft dodger. But then you hardly hear that same conservative contingent discuss how Martin Luther King objected to Vietnam. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, again, like you said, that's pieces of the narrative that they try to keep shut down. They try to keep the narrative focused on that one soundbite, you know, and that judge the content of their character and all this, not not their skin color and all that, but the question who's doing the judging. But two things to read. One is the Trumpet of Conscience. It's a tiny book, maybe 100 pages if it's that, maybe 80 pages by King, and he goes through and he talks about that Vietnam piece, and you might be able to hear somewhere online. There's a tape of King, and the title of that speech is "Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam." Much of that is written in Trumpet of Conscience, but if you want to listen to it, try to find that "Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam." He goes into it, and he was making that segue into the war, the Poor People's Campaign at the time. And that Poor People's Campaign said, look, we're not just talking about race as just race. We're talking about how poor folks, regardless of race and ethnicity, are all suffering from this thing, poverty, and it doesn't have to happen. So he was grounding up what the Panthers later called the Rainbow Coalition, and Jesse Jackson later also used that term. And so he was taking poor whites from Appalachia and Puerto Ricans from the urban north, Mexican Chicanos, Mexican Americans, or Chicanos from the Southwest, blacks from all around, middle-class whites who supported this effort, and bringing them together to make this change. And that it was in the midst of those three things: the anti-war movement, the worker struggle, and this Poor People's Campaign, uniting these people around these various issues. And also, why he was critical in some ways of Black Power, he was critical of the slogan more than the content, because he wanted to rename it Black Consciousness. He wanted the young people to rename it Black Consciousness. Not that they need to get rid of it, he just thought it was a poor choice of words. But he refused to deny those people. You understand what I'm saying? He refused to condemn them. He could critique them, but not condemn them.
Okay.
So that's when the triggers got itchy. And people said this most powerful Negro, this most dangerous Negro in America has to go.
And he certainly did. So Dre, let me give you the final word as we close this out. Two questions in a way. What was the biggest surprise you learned about Dr. King? Not necessarily just in interviewing his former sister-in-law, but any of the work that you did as a journalist. What was the thing that stands out the most?
Actually, it's some of my more recent information. Doing research on Williamsburg and the Black population community here. And there was a day that Martin Luther King Jr. showed up to First Baptist Church just to be in the audience, not to give a speech, not to give a sermon, not to lead a protest. And this wasn't a response to anything. It was another one of those moments where it's like, wow, so Martin Luther King really wasn't the superhero that the media has made him to be in Black history. And it's not to say that he wasn't, prolific and he wasn't polarizing. It's to say that he was human. And I think that element was left out. So just to know that there was a day that he just said, man, look, I don't want no trouble. I don't want no following. I don't want no media. I just want to hear the word and go on my way. Right. So hearing the stories of the individuals from First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, Virginia, listening to them recant those days, when he just popped in, was like, hey, Martin Luther King, I'm here to listen. And I had a newfound resurgence in wanting to find out more about him. I mean, as if, Coretta Scott King's sister saying that he was the first Black man that Coretta Scott King dated wasn't enough to make you want to go dig deeper. But just to know that he had that moment where he wasn't on the agenda for anything. He was just another person, another face in the audience. I think that we don't do enough to talk about him in that light. And I've seen other Blacks be scrutinized to the most minute situation. And we know all aspects of their lives, you know, but his life is the enigma. And it's the enigma because he was chosen to be the safe Negro after he was the most dangerous Negro. Exactly. And when you think about it, the safest Negro is a dead Negro, because you're not going to argue, you're not going to fuss, you're not going to fight, you're not going to protest. You're out of sight, out of mind, you're gone. So he will have the crown of being both.
Right.
Because of that.
Exactly. So gentlemen, again, another great discussion. Glad to have the whole band back together. To all of you that watch us, thank you for continuing to support us, and we'll see you next time.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and taught to have no fear.